March 15, 2019. I still remember the exact time when everything changed. 2,347 hours, Syrian border, forward operating base Delta, 7. The coordinates are burned into my memory. 36 degrees 12 minutes north, 41 degrees 8 minutes east. I was Corporal Marcus Morrison then, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, and what I'm about to tell you happened during what we thought was just another routine patrol. The night started normal enough. Operation Nighthawk was supposed to be straightforward: establish a temporary perimeter, test new communication systems in electromagnetically challenging terrain. Our 8-man team had been deployed with standard equipment and /PRC-152 radios, PVS-14 night vision goggles, and a single M1151 Humvee, serial number 4K7B19331. The weather was clear, temperature holding steady at 8 degrees Celsius, wind from the southeast at 12 kilometers per hour. Perfect conditions for what should have been a textbook operation. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had briefed us personally before deployment. I remember his exact words because they stuck with me. This sector has been giving our comms people headaches for months. We need to know if it's environmental or something else. At the time, I thought he meant equipment interference. I was wrong about a lot of things that night. We were positioned on a ridge overlooking the main supply route when Specialist Chen spotted something through his thermal scope. Movement, 2 clicks northeast, he whispered through the comm. I adjusted my NVGs and saw it immediately, a vehicle, stationary, about 800 meters from our position. The problem was, it wasn't supposed to be there. The Humvee was identical to ours, same configuration, sitting in the middle of what looked like an old caravan route. Engine still running, I could see the heat signature from the exhaust. Chen ran the thermal scan twice. Vehicle's hot, Corporal. Someone was just driving it. That's when things got strange. I mean really strange, not just combat strange. We approached using standard protocols, expecting to find broken down friendlies or maybe civilians who'd gotten lost. Instead, we found something that still doesn't make sense to me 3 years later. The Humvee was completely intact. Doors closed, equipment secured, radio still transmitting on our frequency. Personal gear was stowed properly, weapons rack locked, even the coffee in the thermos was still warm. But there was no crew. No blood, no shell casings, no signs of struggle. Nothing. Chin checked the vehicle identification numbers against our database. The Humvee belonged to a patrol that had gone missing 72 hours earlier. The same patrol whose last known transmission had come from coordinates 15 kilometers south of our position. I remember staring at my GPS display, checking it 3 times because what I was seeing made no sense. The coordinates were showing 2 positions simultaneously for the same vehicle, its last known location and where we were standing. The radio was the worst part. It was still broadcasting the last transmission from the missing crew. Over and over, every 37 minutes, the same message. Base, this is Patrol 79. Request immediate extraction. Situation compromised. Repeat, situation compromised. The timestamp showed the message had been recorded 71 hours and 23 minutes ago. I felt this cold weight in my stomach, the kind you get when you know something's fundamentally wrong but you can't identify what. The hair on my arms was standing up, and I noticed Chen kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to be there. We called it in immediately. Colonel Hayes' voice came back tense. Corporal, confirm vehicle condition and crew status. When I reported the crew missing, there was a long pause before he responded. Understood. Secure the vehicle and maintain position. Do not, repeat, do not attempt to operate that vehicle. The forensic team arrived 40 minutes later. I watched them work, expecting answers, but they looked as confused as we were. The tire tracks leading to the vehicle's position simply stopped. Not gradually, not like someone had gotten out and walked away. They just ended, like the Humvee had been placed there by invisible hands. The lead investigator, a captain whose name I never learned, pulled me aside. Corporal, I need you to understand something. The engine oil is still circulating. The brake pads are warm. This vehicle was in motion when it was abandoned. But there's no evidence anyone was ever inside it. I remember feeling like the ground was shifting under my feet. Not physically, but mentally. Everything I understood about cause and effect, about how things work in the real world, was starting to crack. The strangest part came when they tried to move the vehicle. 3 separate attempts to tow it failed. The cables snapped, the winch burned out, and during the 3rd attempt, the tow truck's engine just died. No mechanical failure they could identify. It simply stopped running when they tried to pull that Humvee. They finally got it moved the next morning, but it took a tank recovery vehicle and 4 hours of work. The whole time, I kept thinking about that radio message, playing on repeat, and wondering where the hell Patrol 79 had gone. We never found them. 3 weeks after we found that empty Humvee, I was transferred to headquarters for what they called specialized analysis duty. Really, it meant sitting in a windowless room with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes and a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst named Dr. Sarachin, no relation to my teammate. What I learned in that room changed everything I thought I knew about our deployment. Dr. Chin had files. Thick ones. Classified ones. She spread them across the metal table like she was dealing cards, each folder marked with dates going back 18 months. "Corporal Morrison," she said, her voice clinical but tired, "what happened to your patrol wasn't unique. It was the 4th incident." The first case had occurred in September 2017. A logistics convoy, 3 vehicles, 12 personnel. They'd been en route to deliver supplies to an outpost 40 kilometers east of our position. Radio contact was maintained throughout their journey until 03:47 hours, when their convoy commander reported arriving at the destination. Problem was, the outpost had been abandoned for 6 months. When the search team arrived, they found all 3 vehicles parked in perfect formation outside the empty base. Engines running, cargo intact, crews gone. I remember staring at the photographs Dr. Chin showed me. The vehicles looked exactly like ours had, untouched, as if their occupants had simply vanished mid-task. One truck still had its loading ramp down, like someone had been in the middle of unloading supplies. The driver's seat in the lead vehicle showed the impression of someone who'd been sitting there moments before. The second incident happened 4 months later. A reconnaissance team investigating reported weapons caches near the old Byzantine ruins, about 12 kilometers from where we'd found our Humvee. 6 soldiers, 2 vehicles. Their last transmission came at 1,623 hours. "Base, we've located the cache. Moving to investigate." When backup arrived 8 hours later, they found one vehicle completely buried in sand, as if it had been there for years. The other was perched impossibly on top of a stone wall, 15 feet off the ground, with no tire tracks or equipment marks to explain how it got there. "The interesting thing," Dr. Chin said, pulling out another file, "is the electromagnetic signatures we recorded during each incident." She showed me readings that looked like seismic charts, all spikes and valleys. Massive interference, always lasting exactly 17 minutes. Always beginning at the moment of last radio contact. The third case was the one that made my hands shake. November 2018, almost exactly 4 months before our encounter. A Special Forces team conducting night surveillance had reported unusual visual phenomena at coordinates that were less than 2 kilometers from where we'd been positioned. Their final transmission was different from the others. "Command, we're observing multiple personnel in outdated military gear. Request guidance on rules of engagement with unidentified combatants." The response from command had been immediate, negative on engagement. Maintain observation and report. But there was never another report. The team's vehicles were found 3 days later, arranged in a perfect circle around what appeared to be an ancient stone marker that wasn't on any of our maps. The marker had inscriptions in multiple languages, Greek, Arabic, and something the linguists couldn't identify. Dr. Chin leaned back in her chair, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She'd been working this pattern for months, trying to make sense of something that defied every rational explanation. "Corporal, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. During your encounter, did you experience any temporal displacement? Any sense that time was moving differently?" I thought about it, really thought about it. There had been something. When we were examining that Humvee, I'd kept checking my watch because it felt like we'd been there for hours, but only 20 minutes had passed. And there was this feeling, like I was watching everything happen from outside my own body. Maybe I told her. It's hard to explain. Everything felt slowed down, like we were moving through thick air. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. Every survivor from these incidents reports the same thing. Time distortion, feelings of detachment, and… She paused, looking uncomfortable. Auditory hallucinations. Voices speaking in languages they don't recognize. That hit me like a punch, because I had heard something that night, just at the edge of my perception. Voices, distant and rhythmic, like people chanting or maybe marching. I'd convinced myself it was just the wind, but Dr. Chen's words brought it all flooding back. There's something else, she continued, opening a final folder. We've been monitoring the area continuously since your incident. Every 127 hours, we detect the same electromagnetic signature. Same duration, same intensity. Whatever happened to those missing personnel, it's still happening. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes spoke for the first time since the briefing began. His voice was heavy, like he was carrying weight he couldn't share. Corporal, we need to know if you're willing to go back out there. We're planning a follow-up mission, and we need someone who's experienced the phenomenon firsthand. I felt my throat go dry. The thought of returning to that place, of maybe encountering whatever had taken those other soldiers, made every instinct I had scream in protest. But these were my people who'd gone missing. Marines, soldiers, good people who'd signed up to serve their country and had vanished into something none of us understood. What kind of mission, sir? I asked, already knowing I was going to say yes. Dr. Chen exchanged a look with the colonel before answering. Observation and documentation. We're going to be there when the next cycle begins. We need to know what we're dealing with, and we need proof that won't disappear into classified files. The next cycle was calculated to begin in 63 hours. Somewhere out there in the Syrian desert, something was waiting, something that had been taking our people for almost 2 years. And somehow, I'd become the key to understanding what it was. Looking back now, I wish I'd said no. But I couldn't abandon those missing soldiers, couldn't walk away from the possibility of finally getting answers. Even if those answers would turn out to be more terrifying than the questions they replaced. The briefing room at 6 o'clock hours felt different from any I'd been in before. Not just the classified atmosphere or the unusual mix of person, though that was strange enough. Along with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes and Dr. Chen, there were 2 men in civilian clothes who never gave their names, a communications specialist from Fort Gordon and a chaplain. A chaplain. That should have been my first warning about what we were walking into. Hayes laid out the mission parameters with military precision, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath his professional tone. Operation Silent Watch. Your team will establish an observation post at coordinates 36 degrees 12 minutes 15 seconds north, 41 degrees 8 minutes 22 seconds east, approximately 200 meters southeast of the previous incident site. Mission duration, 72 hours, coinciding with the predicted electromagnetic event. The team they'd assembled was unusual. Besides myself, there were 5 others. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran with 3 combat deployments and nerves like steel cables. Corporal Jenkins, our communications expert who'd somehow volunteered for this after reading the classified reports. Specialist Kowalski, a combat medic who'd seen more battlefield trauma than most doctors. Private First Class Turner, barely 21 but with an electronics background that made him valuable for the specialized equipment we'd be carrying, and Master Sergeant Williams, a career soldier who'd been specifically requested for this mission by someone high up the chain of command. The equipment briefing took 2 hours. Standard battlefield gear, but supplemented with devices I'd never seen before. Dr. Chen walked us through each piece. Electromagnetic field detectors that looked like oversized metal detectors, digital recording equipment rated for extreme interference, and cameras designed to function during electronic warfare scenarios. The most unusual item was a device she called a temporal displacement monitor, a briefcase-sized unit that would supposedly measure any distortions in local time flow. Gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying a weight that made us all pay attention, you need to understand that you may be documenting something unprecedented. Whatever you observe, whatever you record, could change our understanding of reality itself. Jenkins raised his hand like we were in some kind of classroom. Ma'am, with respect, What exactly are we expecting to encounter? Dr. Chen looked at the unnamed civilians before answering, and I noticed one of them gave a slight nod. Based on previous incidents and ongoing monitoring, we anticipate a localized electromagnetic disturbance beginning at approximately 2,347 hours on day 2 of your deployment. During this disturbance, you may observe visual phenomena that appear to be military personnel from various historical periods. These appearances seem to follow patterns consistent with military formations and movements. Kowalski spoke up, his medic training showing. Are we talking about hallucinations? Mass hysteria? Because if this is psychological, we need different protocols. The unnamed civilian finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. Negative. Physical evidence suggests these manifestations have measurable reality. Previous teams have recorded weight impressions, electromagnetic signatures, and acoustic phenomena that cannot be explained by psychological factors alone. The chaplain's presence finally made sense when he stood to address us. Gentlemen, you may encounter things that challenge your understanding of life, death, and the nature of existence itself. If any of you have religious or philosophical concerns about this mission, now is the time to express them. I remember feeling this strange mixture of fear and curiosity. Part of me wanted to walk away, to request transfer to any other assignment. But a bigger part needed to know what had happened to those missing soldiers, needed to understand what we were really dealing with out there in the desert. The psychological evaluation was mandatory. Each of us spent an hour with a military psychiatrist who asked questions that seemed designed to measure our grip on reality rather than our fitness for combat. Do you believe in supernatural phenomena? Have you ever experienced unexplained events? How do you typically respond to situations that challenge your worldview? I answered honestly mostly. I told him about the voices I'd heard during our first encounter, about the feeling that time had moved differently. What I didn't tell him was how those 17 minutes of the electromagnetic disturbance had felt like hours in my memory, or how I'd been having dreams about soldiers marching through endless sand ever since. Williams pulled me aside after the evaluation. He was old-school military, the kind of NCO who'd seen everything twice and survived to tell about it. Morrison, he said, I've been briefed on things you haven't. This mission isn't just about observation. They're hoping we can make contact. That stopped me cold. Contact with what, Sergeant? With whoever or whatever is taking our people. Command thinks these manifestations might be attempting some form of communication. They want us to try to establish dialogue. He looked around to make sure we weren't being overheard. The missing personnel from previous incidents, they think they might still be alive somewhere. Or something. The final briefing covered rules of engagement, which were unlike anything I'd encountered in my military career. We were authorized to attempt communication using standard military protocols. We were not authorized to fire unless directly threatened. Most importantly, we were under strict orders to maintain our position regardless of what we observed, unless continuing observation would result in immediate threat to life. Hayes concluded with words that still echo in my memory, "Gentlemen, you may be about to witness something that will redefine modern warfare. You're not just soldiers on this mission, you're pioneers exploring the edge of human understanding." As we loaded into the transport vehicles, I caught myself wondering if any of us would return with the same understanding of reality we were leaving with. The desert ahead held answers to questions I wasn't sure I wanted to ask, but I was committed now. In 36 hours, we'd be positioned at the epicenter of something that had been taking American soldiers for almost 2 years. The strangest part was how normal everything felt in those final moments before deployment. Equipment checks, radio tests, last-minute coordination with command. Just another mission, except for the feeling that we were walking towards something that might fundamentally change us all. Turner was checking his electronic equipment when he looked up at me. "Corporal, do you really think we're going to see dead soldiers walking around out there?" I didn't have an answer for him then. I wish I still didn't have an answer for him now. Day 2, 23:30 hours. 17 minutes before the predicted event, and I could feel the wrongness in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. We'd been in position for 36 hours, rotating watch schedules, monitoring our equipment, and trying to stay professional while every instinct told us to get the hell out of there. Our observation post was a natural depression in the rock formation, giving us clear sight lines to the coordinates where previous incidents had occurred. The specialized equipment Dr. Chen had provided was spread around our position like some kind of scientific altar. Turner was hunched over the electromagnetic monitors, watching readings that had been climbing steadily for the past hour. "Corporal," he whispered, his voice tight with concentration, "the EM field strength just doubled in the last 10 minutes. These readings are off the charts." I moved to check his display, and what I saw made my mouth go dry. The electromagnetic signature was building toward something massive, something that would make a radar jamming operation look like a flashlight. Williams was on the radio with command, his voice professional but strained. "Base, this is Observer 1. Confirming anomalous readings across all monitoring equipment. Request permission to withdraw to secondary position." The response came back immediate and uncompromising. "Negative, Observer 1. Maintain position and continue documentation." At 23:45 hours, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than 2 minutes. Not gradually, suddenly, like someone had opened a freezer door. Jenkins was monitoring atmospheric conditions and looked at his instruments like they'd malfunctioned. "This isn't possible," he muttered. "Barometric pressure just spiked, temperatures dropping, but there's no weather system within 100 kilometers. Rodriguez grabbed my arm, pointing toward the target area. "Movement, Corporal. Grid reference 127, distance 400 meters. I raised my night vision and felt my world shift sideways. What I saw through those green-tinted lenses shouldn't have been possible, but there it was, clear as anything I'd ever witnessed. A formation of soldiers was emerging from what appeared to be empty air. Not walking from behind cover or rising from concealed positions, literally materializing, like they were stepping through an invisible doorway. The lead figure was clearly an officer, wearing what looked like World War II-era American uniforms, complete with steel pot helmets and period-correct equipment. "Jesus Christ," Kolsky breathed, his medic training forgotten as he stared through his own optics. "Are you all seeing this?" The confirmations came back in whispers from around our position. 6 trained soldiers, all witnessing the same impossible sight. The formation was precise, textbook military movement. 12 figures in total, advancing in standard infantry formation toward coordinates that matched exactly where we'd found the abandoned Humvee weeks earlier. Turner's equipment was going haywire, displays flickering and alarms chirping softly as electromagnetic readings peaked beyond the scales. That's when the voices started. Not human voices, not exactly, but something that carried across the desert air with crystal clarity despite the impossible distance. Commands in what sounded like multiple languages, English, but also something that might have been German, and underlying it all, something older that I couldn't identify. Jenkins had his directional microphones active, and his expression was pure disbelief. "Corporal, I'm getting clean audio. Multiple speakers, but the acoustics are all wrong. These voices are coming from everywhere and nowhere." He adjusted his headphones and went pale. "Sir, I think I'm hearing radio chatter from the missing patrol. From 3 weeks ago." The temporal displacement monitor that Dr. Chen had insisted we bring was displaying readings that made no sense according to anything I understood about physics. The device was showing multiple time signatures simultaneously, as if past, present, and future were occupying the same space. At 23:52 hours, the formation stopped and turned toward our position. Even through night vision across 400 meters of desert, I could see the lead figure looking directly at us. Not scanning, not searching, looking right at our concealed position like he knew exactly where we were. Williams was trying to maintain radio contact with command, but our communications were deteriorating rapidly. Static filled every frequency, punctuated by fragments of conversations that couldn't be happening. I heard snippets of radio chatter from operations I'd participated in months earlier, voices of soldiers who were currently stationed thousands of miles away. "Base, this is Observer 1, Williams said into his handset, but the response that came back wasn't from our command center. It was a voice speaking in what sounded like French, urgent and frightened, talking about artillery positions and requesting immediate evacuation. When Williams tried again, the radio was completely dead. The figures began moving toward us, maintaining their precise formation but covering ground faster than should have been possible. Turner's equipment was showing impossible readings. The manifestations were registering on infrared as slightly cooler than ambient air temperature, but they were casting shadows in our artificial illumination and leaving footprints in the sand. Kowalski was shaking his head, muttering medical terminology under his breath like he was trying to diagnose a condition that had no name. Hypothermia doesn't work like this. Mass hallucinations don't create physical evidence. This is... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. At 2,359 hours, the lead figure raised his right hand, and the entire formation stopped exactly 50 meters from our position. Close enough that I could see details through my night vision that made my hands shake. Uniforms from different eras, World War II, Vietnam, Desert Storm, and others I couldn't immediately place. Some bore insignia I recognized, others carried equipment that belonged to units that had been disbanded decades ago. The officer lowered his hand and began speaking. Not shouting, not even raising his voice, but every word carried across the distance with perfect clarity. English, but with an accent I couldn't place and a cadence that belonged to no contemporary military. "American soldiers," he said, and his voice seemed to come from inside my own head, "you have entered a place where service transcends time. We have been waiting for you to come back." Jenkins looked at me with eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Corporal, did he just say, 'come back'? Like we've been here before?" The temporal displacement monitor was screaming warnings now, its displays showing time distortions that suggested we were experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously. Past, present, and future bleeding together in ways that made my head ache to think about. And then, at exactly 0006 hours, they were gone. Not fading, not retreating, simply absent, like they had never been there. The electromagnetic readings dropped to normal levels instantly, the temperature returned to ambient, and our radio communications came back online with startling clarity. Command's voice crackled through immediately. "Observer 1, report status. We lost all contact for 17 minutes. 17 minutes. Exactly the duration Dr. Chen had predicted. But for us, the encounter had felt like hours of suspended time, each moment stretched and distorted beyond normal experience. Williams keyed his radio with hands that weren't quite steady. "Base, Observer 1. Contact confirmed. Requesting immediate extraction and debrief." But I was staring at the sand where the formation had stood, where their footprints were clearly visible in the soft ground, leading from nowhere to nowhere. Physical evidence of something that shouldn't exist, left behind by soldiers who might have been dead for decades. The debriefing lasted 14 hours. Not consecutively, they broke us up, isolated us, questioned us individually and then together, like they were trying to catch us in some kind of elaborate lie. But how do you lie about something that defies every law of physics you've ever learned? Dr. Chen had assembled a team that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Physicists, historians, linguistics experts, and people whose credentials were so classified they couldn't even tell us their real names. They set up in a secure facility 2 hours' drive from our base, the kind of place that doesn't exist on any public maps. The footage from our equipment should have been the smoking gun, undeniable proof of what we'd witnessed. Instead, it raised more questions than it answered. The infrared cameras had captured heat signatures that were cooler than the surrounding air. The audio equipment had recorded voices speaking in languages that the linguists identified as Latin, Middle English, and something they called Proto-Germanic, languages that predated modern military terminology by centuries. Professor Mitchell, the historian they'd brought in from Georgetown, spread maps across the conference table like he was planning a military campaign. Medieval maps, Ottoman survey charts, Byzantine military reports. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades studying warfare, "this location has been a crossroads of conflict for over 2,000 years. The archaeological evidence was what really made my hands shake. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed layer upon layer of military encampments buried beneath the sand. Roman legion positions, Crusader fortifications, Ottoman defensive works, and beneath it all, something older that the archaeologists couldn't identify. It was like the desert had been absorbing military presence for millennia, storing it somehow. Dr. Chen pulled up a three-dimensional map on her laptop that showed the electromagnetic anomalies we detected. The field distortions aren't random, she explained, pointing to patterns that looked almost organic. They follow the same geometric configurations found in ancient military formations. Roman testudo, medieval schiltron, modern squad movements, all overlapping in the same physical space. Rodriguez asked the question we were all thinking. Are you saying that every army that's ever fought in that area is somehow still there? Dr. Chen exchanged glances with the unnamed officials before answering. We're saying that the intense emotional and psychological energy generated by military conflict may have created a kind of temporal echo. A recording, if you will, that plays back under specific conditions. She paused, looking at data that I couldn't begin to understand. But these aren't just recordings. They interact with present-day personnel. They show awareness, intent, purpose. The linguistics team had been analyzing the audio from our encounter. Professor Hartley, a woman who spoke 7 languages and looked like she'd spent her life buried in ancient texts, played back segments of the voices we'd heard. The English speaker used terminology consistent with World War II-era military commands, but with pronunciations that suggest earlier periods. The Latin phrases are religious in nature, prayers for the dead, requests for absolution. Jenkins leaned forward, his electronics background making him focus on the technical aspects. Dr. Chen, our equipment showed temporal displacement readings. Are you telling us that time actually moved differently during the encounter? Her answer made the room go quiet. Based on your equipment logs and our monitoring stations, your 17-minute encounter occurred simultaneously with electromagnetic signatures spanning approximately 4 hours of recorded activity. From our perspective, you experienced multiple time periods concurrently. The really disturbing part came when they showed us the satellite imagery. The area where we'd witnessed the manifestation showed traces of military activity that shouldn't exist. Tire tracks from vehicles that had been scrapped decades ago, footprints following patrol patterns that matched missing unit procedures, and most unsettling of all, recent disturbances in the sand that formed the outlines of military encampments from various historical periods. Williams, who'd been quiet through most of the debriefing, finally spoke up. What happened to the missing personnel? The soldiers who disappeared during previous incidents. The silence that followed his question was answer enough, but one of the unnamed officials finally responded. We believe they may have become part of the phenomenon, absorbed into whatever temporal distortion exists in that location. He pulled out a folder marked with classifications I'd never seen before. We've detected voice signatures matching missing personnel during subsequent electromagnetic events. They appear to be integrated into the historical military formations. The medical evaluation came next. Full physical examinations, psychological assessments, blood work to check for environmental toxins or hallucinogenic compounds. Everything came back normal, which somehow made the whole experience more terrifying. We weren't sick, we weren't drugged, we weren't suffering from group hallucination. We'd witnessed something real that shouldn't be possible. Dr. Chen showed us the final piece of evidence that made everything click into a horrifying kind of sense. We've identified similar electromagnetic anomalies at other historical battlefields around the world. Gettysburg, Verdun, the Somme, Stalingrad. Every major conflict site shows traces of the same temporal distortion we recorded in Syria. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Every battlefield where soldiers had died in large numbers, where the intensity of combat had reached levels that break human understanding, was potentially harboring the same phenomenon. Armies of the dead, trapped in eternal service, replaying their final missions across centuries. Kowalski asked the question that had been haunting me since our encounter: are they trying to communicate something? Or are they just stuck? Professor Mitchell answered, his historian's perspective providing context that military training couldn't. Throughout history, soldiers have reported encounters with fallen comrades on battlefields. What we traditionally dismissed as combat stress or grief manifestations may actually be temporal intersections. places where the barrier between past and present becomes permeable due to the intensity of military sacrifice. The final revelation came when they showed us enhanced audio analysis of our encounter. Hidden beneath the obvious voices, acoustic experts had detected something else: radio chatter from units that had gone missing not just in Syria, but from conflicts spanning decades. Vietnam patrol reports, Korean War artillery coordinates, World War II bomber crew communications, all layered together in an impossible chorus of military operations that should have ended long ago. As we prepared to leave the debriefing facility, Dr. Chen pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Corporal Morrison, we're planning a follow-up mission. Something more active than observation." Her words sent ice through my veins, but I found myself nodding before she'd even finished explaining. "We need to attempt direct communication with the phenomenon. We need to understand if these manifestations can be reasoned with, negotiated with, or if they represent a threat that requires different solutions." Walking out of that facility, I realized that everything I'd believed about life, death, and the nature of military service had been fundamentally altered. Somewhere in the Syrian desert, soldiers from across history were trapped in an endless war, and we'd been chosen to figure out what to do about it. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any equipment I'd ever carried into combat. 6 weeks of preparation. That's what they gave us before sending us back into what everyone was carefully avoiding calling the anomaly zone. 6 weeks of training with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science lab rather than a military operation, briefings with specialists whose existence was so classified they communicated through intermediaries, and psychological conditioning that was supposed to prepare us for extended contact with temporal displacement phenomena. The team had changed. Rodriguez had requested transfer after the first mission, couldn't blame him. Jenkins stayed, but I could see the weight of what we'd witnessed in the way he checked and rechecked every piece of communication equipment. Turner had actually volunteered to return, his electronics background making him fascinated rather than terrified by what we'd encountered. Kowalski remained our medic, though I noticed he'd added some unusual items to his medical kit, things for treating conditions that shouldn't exist. Williams had been promoted to Operation Commander, and they'd brought in 3 new specialists. Dr. Marcus Webb, a physicist from Los Alamos whose credentials were partially redacted even in classified documents. Sergeant Lisa Vaughn, a communications expert who specialized in what they called non-standard frequency analysis. And Captain James Morrison, no relation, despite the shared name, whose background was listed simply as Temporal Research Liaison. The equipment briefing took place in a facility that I'm pretty sure doesn't appear on any organizational charts. Dr. Chin had developed what she called interactive monitoring systems, devices designed not just to record the electromagnetic phenomena, but to respond to them. The centerpiece was something she referred to as a temporal communication array, a collection of modified radio equipment that could supposedly transmit across the time distortions we'd encountered. The theory, Dr. Webb explained, his academic tone not quite hiding his excitement, is that if these manifestations represent some form of temporal echo, we might be able to establish two-way communication by matching their electromagnetic signature. He showed us devices that looked like standard military radios crossed with university laboratory equipment. Captain Morrison pulled me aside during one of the equipment sessions. "Corporal, I need you to understand something about this mission that isn't in the official briefing. We have reason to believe that the missing personnel from previous incidents may still be recoverable." The way he said it made my stomach clench with a mixture of hope and dread. "Recoverable how, sir?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. The electromagnetic signatures we've been monitoring suggest that time displacement doesn't necessarily mean death. It may mean relocation. Temporal relocation. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We think our missing soldiers might be alive somewhere in that temporal overlap, and we think we might be able to bring them back." The psychological preparation was unlike anything I'd experienced in military training. Sessions with specialists who asked questions about our concept of linear time, our attachment to specific historical periods, our comfort level with the idea that past and present might exist simultaneously. They made us practice communication protocols for contact with personnel from different military eras, complete with period-appropriate terminology and command structures. Dr. Chen showed us enhanced analysis of our previous encounter that revealed details we'd missed in the moment. The formation you observed included personnel from at least 6 different time periods, but they were operating under unified command structure. Someone or something is coordinating these temporal military units. The mission parameters were more complex this time. Instead of passive observation, we were authorized to attempt communication using the specialized equipment. Our objectives included establishing contact with the manifestation commanders, attempting to locate missing contemporary personnel, and if possible, negotiating some form of resolution to the temporal displacement incidents. Williams briefed us on rules of engagement that belonged in a philosophy textbook rather than a military manual. You are authorized to communicate with any entity that demonstrates military bearing and command structure, regardless of apparent historical origin. You are not authorized to follow orders from personnel who cannot be verified through contemporary chain of command. Most importantly, you are not authorized to accept any invitation to join or accompany entities beyond our established timeline. The night before deployment, I found myself questioning every decision that had led me to volunteer for this mission. The rational part of my mind kept screaming that we were walking into something that could destroy our understanding of reality itself. But the soldier in me couldn't abandon the possibility of recovering missing personnel, even if they were lost somewhere in the spaces between past and present. Sergeant Vaughn had been analyzing the audio from our previous encounter and discovered something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The voices we recorded include fragments of radio chatter from units that haven't been deployed yet. Future operations, using call signs that won't be assigned for another 6 months. The implications of that discovery hung over our final briefing like a storm cloud. If the temporal phenomenon could access future military operations, we weren't just dealing with echoes of past conflicts, we were potentially walking into something that knew what we were going to do before we decided to do it. Dr. Webb made one final adjustment to the temporal communication array and looked up at our team with an expression that mixed scientific curiosity with genuine concern. Gentlemen, if this technology works as designed, you may be about to have conversations with soldiers from across the entire span of human warfare. I need you to remember that you're representing not just contemporary military forces, but potentially all of military history. As we loaded into the transport vehicles for our return to the anomaly zone, Turner asked a question that had been haunting all of us. Corporal, what if they don't want to be rescued? What if being part of that temporal formation is better than whatever they left behind? I didn't have an answer for him then, but I was about to find out that the question itself revealed how little we understood about what we were walking into. The desert ahead held not just missing soldiers, but potentially the key to understanding the true cost of military service across all of human history. The weight of that responsibility felt like carrying the entire burden of warfare itself, and I realized that whatever happened during this mission would change not just our understanding of the missing personnel, but our understanding of what it truly means to serve. Day 3, 2,341 hours. 6 minutes before the predicted manifestation, and every piece of equipment we'd brought was already screaming warnings. The electromagnetic readings were climbing faster than our previous encounter, building towards something that Dr. Webb's instruments suggested would be exponentially more intense than anything we'd recorded before. Our position was different this time, closer to the epicenter, with the temporal communication array positioned for maximum effectiveness. The specialized radio equipment hummed with a frequency that seemed to resonate in my chest, creating a vibration that felt almost like a heartbeat. Turner was monitoring the electromagnetic sensors while Sergeant Vaughn prepared the communication protocols we'd rehearsed for weeks. Contact -4 minutes, Williams announced through our comm system, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension that we all felt. All personnel, prepare for manifestation event. The temperature began dropping at 2,345 hours, but this time it felt different. Not the sudden, unnatural cold we'd experienced before, but a gradual descent that seemed to pull warmth from our bodies rather than simply chilling the air around us. Kowalski was monitoring our vital signs and reported that all team members were showing elevated heart rates and blood pressure despite our training. At 2,346 hours, the first visual distortions began. The air itself seemed to shimmer, like heat waves in reverse, creating a translucent barrier between our world and something else. Through my night vision, I could see shapes beginning to coalesce beyond that barrier, military formations from multiple time periods, but organized with a precision that suggested unified command. "Communication array is active," Vaughn reported, her fingers dancing across the modified radio controls. "I'm detecting multiple frequency signatures, including some that match the audio from our previous encounter." The equipment she was operating looked like something from a movie about time travel, but the readings it was producing were undeniably real. The manifestation began at exactly 2,347 hours, but this time it was different. Instead of soldiers emerging from empty air, we watched as the landscape itself seemed to shift and overlay multiple time periods simultaneously. Roman fortifications appeared beneath medieval siege works, which existed alongside World War II defensive positions, all occupying the same physical space but existing in different temporal layers. The soldiers appeared in formations that spanned centuries of military evolution. I could see Roman legionnaires maintaining perfect testudo formation while World War I doughboys advanced with fixed bayonets through the same space. Vietnam-era patrol units moved through terrain that simultaneously showed signs of Crusader encampments and modern military positions. But what made this encounter different was their awareness of us. The moment our positions became visible, every formation, regardless of historical origin, turned toward our location with coordinated precision. Hundreds of soldiers from across military history, all focused on our small team with an intensity that made my hands shake. Captain Morrison activated the temporal communication array, and his voice carried across the desert with artificial amplification. "This is Captain Morrison, United States Army, contemporary timeline. We are seeking communication with commanding officers of manifested military units." The response came immediately, but not from a single source. Multiple voices spoke in unison, creating a chorus that seemed to emerge from the air itself rather than from any individual soldier. The words were in English, but with accents and pronunciation patterns that represented different historical periods speaking simultaneously. "American forces, you have returned to the convergence point. We have been waiting for authorization to complete our missions." The voice carried the weight of command authority that transcended any single time period, as if centuries of military leadership were speaking through a single entity. Vaughn's communication equipment was recording everything while simultaneously analyzing the electromagnetic signatures. "Captain, I'm detecting audio patterns that match missing personnel from the past 18 months. They're here, sir. Our people are part of this formation." Williams moved closer to the communication array, his command training taking over despite the impossible circumstances. "This is Master Sergeant Williams. We're requesting status report on American military personnel who have gone missing in this area over the past 2 years." The unified voice responded with military precision that was both familiar and terrifying. "All personnel have been integrated into temporal defense operations. Current mission status, ongoing. Estimated completion, undefined. Request, permission to brief commanding officers on strategic situation." Dr. Webb's temporal monitoring equipment was displaying readings that suggested we were experiencing what he called chronological intersection, multiple timelines existing simultaneously in the same physical space. According to his instruments, we were having a conversation that was taking place across several centuries of time at once. Turner looked up from his electromagnetic sensors with an expression of pure disbelief. "Corporal, the energy signatures are showing that this entire area has become some kind of temporal military base. Every army that's ever fought here has become part of a permanent defensive structure." The manifestation commander, for lack of a better term, began what could only be described as a military briefing. Information flowed through the communication array about defensive positions, strategic assessments, and threats that spanned multiple historical periods. They were describing a war that existed outside normal time, fought by soldiers from every era of human conflict. "The convergence point requires constant defense," the voice explained with the calm authority of career military leadership. "Enemy forces attempt infiltration through temporal vulnerabilities. All integrated personnel maintain readiness status for indefinite deployment duration. Kowalski whispered through our comm system, they think they're still on active duty. All of them. Every soldier who's ever died here believes they're part of an ongoing military operation. The communication array began receiving direct transmissions from individual soldiers within the formation. Voices that Vaughn's equipment identified as matching missing personnel from recent incidents. They spoke with the professional comm of soldiers reporting routine status updates, describing their integration into units commanded by officers from various historical periods. One voice came through clearly, Corporal Martinez from the patrol that had disappeared 3 weeks before our first mission. Base, this is Martinez. Assigned to 3rd century Roman defensive operations under Centurion Aurelius. Mission parameters understood. Requesting supply drop coordinates for modern ammunition to supplement Gladius inventory. The casual way he reported being commanded by a Roman officer while requesting contemporary ammunition made the entire situation feel like a fever dream crossed with a military operation manual. Captain Morrison attempted to establish command authority. Martinez, this is Captain Morrison. You are ordered to report to contemporary command structure for debriefing and extraction. The response revealed the true horror of what we were dealing with. Negative, sir. Current chain of command established through temporal integration protocols. Roman authority supersedes contemporary deployment orders. Mission takes precedence over individual extraction requests. Williams looked at me with an expression that mixed professional frustration with genuine fear. We were witnessing American soldiers who had become so completely integrated into historical military units that they no longer recognized contemporary command authority. The manifestation continued for exactly 17 minutes, but during that time we received strategic intelligence that covered conflicts spanning 2,000 years. Battle plans that had succeeded and failed across centuries, defensive strategies that incorporated everything from Roman siege techniques to modern asymmetric warfare, and most disturbing of all, predictions about future conflicts that the temporal formation claimed to be preparing for. When the electromagnetic disturbance ended and the manifestations faded, we were left with recordings of conversations that challenged everything we understood about military service, chain of command, and the nature of duty itself. But we were also left with the knowledge that somewhere in that temporal overlap, our missing soldiers were alive, serving under the command of historical military leaders, fighting in a war that existed outside time itself. The Pentagon briefing room had the kind of sterile atmosphere that comes with making decisions about things that shouldn't exist. 48 hours after our second encounter, I found myself sitting across from officials whose security clearances were so high they couldn't even tell us which departments they represented. The weight of what we discovered pressed down on everyone in that room like a physical force. General Patricia Hawkins, Joint Chiefs Liaison, spread our mission recordings across the conference table like evidence in a court-martial. Gentlemen, we're facing a situation that has no precedent in military history. We have confirmed contact with American military personnel who are technically still on active duty, but under command structures that predate the United States itself. Dr. Chen had spent the past 2 days analyzing our communication logs, and her findings were displayed on screens that showed temporal flow charts I couldn't begin to understand. The intelligence gathered during the second encounter includes strategic information about enemy movements, defensive positions, and combat effectiveness that spans multiple historical periods. Some of this information could provide significant tactical advantages in contemporary operations. The moral implications of that statement hit me like artillery fire. They were talking about using information provided by soldiers who had become trapped in some kind of eternal military service, soldiers who included our own missing personnel. Williams raised the question that had been haunting all of us since the encounter. General, what about extraction of American personnel? Martinez and the others are still our soldiers, regardless of their current assignment. The pause before that last word carried the weight of everything we couldn't quite comprehend about their situation. An official whose nameplate simply read, DoD classified, leaned forward with the kind of expression that comes with making decisions about acceptable losses. Master Sergeant, preliminary analysis suggests that forced extraction could destabilize the entire temporal phenomenon. We could lose not just the current missing personnel, but potentially create a cascade effect that impacts the timeline itself. Captain Morrison had been quiet through most of the briefing, but he finally spoke up with the kind of moral clarity that made me remember why I'd trusted military leadership in the first place. Sir, with respect, we're talking about abandoning American soldiers who specifically requested extraction during our communication. That goes against everything the military stands for. The response came from General Hawkins, and her words carried the weight of command decisions that keep you awake at night. Captain, we're also talking about strategic intelligence that could save thousands of lives in future operations. The temporal formations have provided detailed information about enemy tactics, supply routes, and defensive strategies that we've never been able to obtain through conventional intelligence gathering. Dr. Chen pulled up audio logs from our encounter, playing back segments where the manifestation commanders had described future conflict scenarios with tactical precision that suggested they could see military operations before they happened. The strategic value of maintaining this communication channel could be immeasurable. We're potentially talking about preventing casualties on a scale that justifies difficult choices. Turner spoke up from his position at the back of the room, his electronics background making him focus on the technical aspects rather than the moral ones. Dr. Chin, are you saying these temporal formations can actually predict future military operations? Her answer made the room go quiet. Not predict. Observe. The temporal overlap appears to exist outside linear time, allowing the formations to access information from past, present, and future military operations simultaneously. She paused, letting the implications sink in. They're offering us the ability to fight wars before they start. The briefing continued for hours, but it became clear that the officials had already made their decision before we'd even arrived. They wanted to maintain communication with the temporal formations, to use the strategic intelligence they provided, regardless of the cost to our missing personnel. Kalski asked the question that cut to the heart of the moral dilemma. What happens to Martinez and the others? Do we just leave them there? Fighting wars that ended centuries ago under the command of dead officers. The DoD official's response revealed the true scope of what we were dealing with. Medical analysis of the communication logs suggests that personnel integrated into the temporal formations may not experience linear time the way we do. From their perspective, they may not have been missing for weeks or months. They may be experiencing all of military history simultaneously. That explanation somehow made the situation worse rather than better. Our soldiers weren't just trapped in the past, they were experiencing every war that had ever been fought, simultaneously, forever. Williams stood up, his career soldier instincts finally reaching their breaking point. General, I request permission to speak freely. When she nodded, he delivered words that still echo in my memory. We're talking about using our own people as a resource while they're trapped in something that sounds like military hell. There has to be a line we won't cross, even for strategic advantage. General Hawkins responded with the kind of cold calculation that comes with making decisions about national security. Master Sergeant, we estimate that the intelligence provided by the temporal formations could prevent casualties numbering in the tens of thousands over the next decade. Against that strategic value, the cost of maintaining the status quo becomes acceptable. The final presentation came from an intelligence analyst whose job was apparently to quantify the value of human suffering in strategic terms. Charts showing potential casualty reduction, graphs displaying tactical advantages, cost-benefit analyses that treated our missing soldiers as acceptable losses in exchange for temporal intelligence. As the briefing concluded, I realized that we were being asked to become complicit in abandoning our own people for the sake of military advantage. The officials made it clear that our role would be to maintain communication with the temporal formations, to gather intelligence, and to never again mention the possibility of extraction. Walking out of that briefing room, I felt like I was carrying the weight of every military decision that had ever sacrificed individuals for strategic necessity. But I also knew that somewhere in that desert, Martinez and the others were still our soldiers, still our responsibility, regardless of what the Pentagon had decided was acceptable. Turner caught up with me in the hallway, his face showing the same moral conflict I was feeling. Corporal, what are we going to do? We can't just leave them there. But I didn't have an answer for him then, and the weight of that unanswered question felt heavier than any equipment I'd ever carried into combat. The choice ahead of us wasn't just about following orders or defying authority. It was about deciding whether strategic advantage was worth the cost of our humanity, and whether some prices are too high to pay, even for national security. 2 weeks after the Pentagon briefing, Williams called me into his office with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the professional calm of a career NCO, but something rawer, the look of a man who'd reached the end of his ability to follow orders that violated everything he believed about military service. "Morrison," he said, closing the door and activating a signal jamming device that wasn't standard issue, "we need to talk about something that's not going in any official report." He pulled out a folder marked with classifications that made my security clearance feel inadequate. "I've been in contact with some people who think the Pentagon's decision about our missing personnel is problematic." The folder contained intelligence reports I'd never seen, communications between officials whose names were redacted, and most disturbing of all, medical assessments of what prolonged temporal displacement might do to human consciousness. The analysis suggested that our missing soldiers weren't just trapped in historical military units, they were experiencing psychological trauma on a scale that had no precedent in medical literature. "They're living every war simultaneously," Williams said, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions that keep soldiers awake at night. "Every battle, every death, every moment of combat terror from the past 2,000 years. And the Pentagon wants to keep them there because they provide useful intelligence." Turner knocked on the office door using a code pattern we developed during our missions. When Williams let him in, I could see that whatever conversation they'd been having had been going on longer than just today. The electronics specialist carried equipment I didn't recognize, devices that looked like they belonged in a demolition operation rather than a communication array. "Corporal," Turner said, his usual technical enthusiasm replaced by grim determination, "we've been working on something that the Pentagon doesn't know about. A way to destabilize the temporal formations. Not to extract our people, that might be impossible, but to end their suffering." The plan they outlined was technically treason, but it felt like the most moral military operation I'd ever been asked to consider. Using modified versions of the temporal communication equipment, they could create what Dr. Webb had called a chronological cascade failure, essentially collapsing the temporal overlaps that kept the formation stable. Williams looked at me with the kind of direct honesty that comes with asking someone to risk everything for principle. "Morrison, I won't lie to you. This operation could end our careers, could result in court-martial, could potentially cause consequences we can't predict. But those are our soldiers out there, trapped in something that makes combat hell look like a vacation." Kowalski arrived 20 minutes later, carrying medical supplies that suggested he'd been preparing for this conversation longer than I'd realized. "Corporal, I've been analyzing the physiological data from our encounters. The stress signatures we recorded from our missing personnel indicate trauma levels that are literally off any scale we use to measure psychological damage. The medical evidence was what finally convinced me. Charts showing brainwave patterns that suggested our soldiers were experiencing continuous combat stress without the relief cycles that keep human minds functional. Hormone levels indicating fear responses that had been sustained for weeks without interruption. Cardiovascular readings that suggested their bodies were slowly burning out from constant fight-or-flight activation. "They're dying slowly," Kowalski said, his medic training making him focus on the human cost rather than the strategic implications. "Maybe not physically, but psychologically, they're being destroyed piece by experiencing centuries of warfare simultaneously." The operation they'd planned was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Using the temporal communication array, they would overload the electromagnetic patterns that maintain the chronological stability of the anomaly zone. The cascade failure would theoretically collapse the temporal overlaps, potentially freeing our trapped personnel by ending the phenomenon entirely. Williams made the stakes clear. "We don't know if this will save them or kill them. We don't know if it will work at all. But we know that leaving them where they are means condemning them to eternal psychological torture for the sake of strategic intelligence." Turner had calculated the timing precisely. The next manifestation event was scheduled for 72 hours from our conversation. The electromagnetic buildup would provide the energy necessary to trigger the cascade failure, but we'd have to be in position to implement the sabotage during the manifestation itself. The biggest risk, Turner explained, is that destabilizing the temporal formations while they're active could cause what Dr. Webb called chronological displacement. We might end up trapped in the same temporal overlap we're trying to collapse. Jenkins joined us for the final planning session, his communication expertise essential for coordinating the sabotage operation. But I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between following orders and following conscience that defines the worst moments of military service. "Gentlemen," Williams said, his command voice carrying the weight of a decision that would define the rest of our lives, "I want each of you to understand that this is voluntary. Anyone who wants to walk away from this operation can do so with no judgment and no consequences. But anyone who stays needs to understand that we're probably ending our military careers to save soldiers who may not be savable." The unanimous decision to proceed took less than 5 minutes. Whatever happened to us, whatever consequences we faced, we couldn't abandon our people to eternal suffering for the sake of strategic advantage. As we prepared to return to the anomaly zone for what we all knew would be our final mission, I found myself thinking about the nature of military service itself, about the obligations that transcend orders, about loyalty that goes deeper than command structure, about the choices that define what it really means to be a soldier. The equipment we loaded for the sabotage operation was heavier than anything we'd carried before, but the weight of our decision felt even heavier. We were about to either save our missing personnel or join them in whatever temporal hell they'd been trapped in. But for the first time since our first encounter with the manifestations, I felt like we were finally doing what soldiers are supposed to do, protecting our own, regardless of the cost. Day 3, 23:41 hours. 6 minutes before the predicted manifestation, and every piece of equipment we'd brought was already screaming warnings. The electromagnetic readings were climbing faster than our previous encounter, building towards something that Dr. Webb's instruments suggested would be exponentially more intense than anything we'd recorded before. Our position was different this time, closer to the epicenter, with the temporal communication array positioned for maximum effectiveness. The specialized radio equipment hummed with a frequency that seemed to resonate in my chest, creating a vibration that felt almost like a heartbeat. Turner was monitoring the electromagnetic sensors while Sergeant Vaughn prepared the communication protocols we'd rehearsed for weeks. "Contact -4 minutes," Williams announced through our comm system, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension that we all felt. "All personnel, prepare for manifestation event." The temperature began dropping at 2,345 hours, but this time it felt different. Not the sudden, unnatural cold we'd experienced before, but a gradual descent that seemed to pull warmth from our bodies rather than simply chilling the air around us. Kowalski was monitoring our vital signs and reported that all team members were showing elevated heart rates and blood pressure despite our training. At 2,346 hours, the first visual distortions began. The air itself seemed to shimmer, like heat waves in reverse, creating a translucent barrier between our world and something else. Through my night vision, I could see shapes beginning to coalesce beyond that barrier, military formations from multiple time periods, but organized with a precision that suggested unified command. "Communication array is active," Vaughn reported, her fingers dancing across the modified radio controls. "I'm detecting multiple frequency signatures, including some that match the audio from our previous encounter." The equipment she was operating looked like something from a movie about time travel, but the readings it was producing were undeniably real. The manifestation began at exactly 2,347 hours, but this time it was different. Instead of soldiers emerging from empty air, we watched as the landscape itself seemed to shift and overlay multiple time periods simultaneously. Roman fortifications appeared beneath medieval siege works, which existed alongside World War II defensive positions, all occupying the same physical space but existing in different temporal layers. The soldiers appeared in formations that spanned centuries of military evolution. I could see Roman legionnaires maintaining perfect testudo formation while World War I doughboys advanced with fixed bayonets through the same space. Vietnam-era patrol units moved through terrain that simultaneously showed signs of Crusader encampments and modern military positions. But what made this encounter different was their awareness of us. The moment our positions became visible, every formation, regardless of historical origin, turned toward our location with coordinated precision. Hundreds of soldiers from across military history, all focused on our small team with an intensity that made my hands shake. Captain Morrison activated the temporal communication array, and his voice carried across the desert with artificial amplification. This is Captain Morrison, United States Army, contemporary timeline. We are seeking communication with commanding officers of manifested military units. The response came immediately, but not from a single source. Multiple voices spoke in unison, creating a chorus that seemed to emerge from the air itself rather than from any individual soldier. The words were in English, but with accents and pronunciation patterns that represented different historical periods speaking simultaneously. American forces, you have returned to the convergence point. We have been waiting for authorization to complete our missions. The voice carried the weight of command authority that transcended any single time period, as if centuries of military leadership were speaking through a single entity. Vaughn's communication equipment was recording everything while simultaneously analyzing the electromagnetic signatures. Captain, I'm detecting audio patterns that match missing personnel from the past 18 months. They're here, sir. Our people are part of this formation. Williams moved closer to the communication array, his command training taking over despite the impossible circumstances. This is Master Sergeant Williams. We're requesting status report on American military personnel who have gone missing in this area over the past 2 years. The unified voice responded with military precision that was both familiar and terrifying. All personnel have been integrated into temporal defense operations. Current mission status, ongoing. Estimated completion, undefined. Request, permission to brief commanding officers on strategic situation. Dr. Webb's temporal monitoring equipment was displaying readings that suggested we were experiencing what he called chronological intersection, multiple timelines existing simultaneously in the same physical space. According to his instruments, we were having a conversation that was taking place across several centuries of time at once. Turner looked up from his electromagnetic sensors with an expression of pure disbelief. Corporal, the energy signatures are showing that this entire area has become some kind of temporal military base. Every army that's ever fought here has become part of a permanent defensive structure. The manifestation commander, for lack of a better term, began what could only be described as a military briefing. Information flowed through the communication array about defensive positions, strategic assessments, and threats that spanned multiple historical periods. They were describing a war that existed outside normal time, fought by soldiers from every era of human conflict. The convergence point requires constant defense, the voice explained with the calm authority of career military leadership. Enemy forces attempt infiltration through temporal vulnerabilities. All integrated personnel maintain readiness status for indefinite deployment duration. Kowalski whispered through our comm system, they think they're still on active duty. All of them. Every soldier who's ever died here believes they're part of an ongoing military operation. The communication array began receiving direct transmissions from individual soldiers within the formation. Voices that Vaughn's equipment identified as matching missing personnel from recent incidents. They spoke with the professional calm of soldiers reporting routine status updates, describing their integration into units commanded by officers from various historical periods. One voice came through clearly, Corporal Martinez from the patrol that had disappeared 3 weeks before our first mission. Base, this is Martinez. Assigned to 3rd century Roman defensive operations under Centurion Aurelius. Mission parameters understood. Requesting supply drop coordinates for modern ammunition to supplement Gladius inventory. The casual way he reported being commanded by a Roman officer while requesting contemporary ammunition made the entire situation feel like a fever dream crossed with a military operation manual. Captain Morrison attempted to establish command authority. Martinez, this is Captain Morrison. You are ordered to report to contemporary command structure for debriefing and extraction. The response revealed the true horror of what we were dealing with. Negative, sir. Current chain of command established through temporal integration protocols. Roman authority supersedes contemporary deployment orders. Mission takes precedence over individual extraction requests. Williams looked at me with an expression that mixed professional frustration with genuine fear. We were witnessing American soldiers who had become so completely integrated into historical military units that they no longer recognized contemporary command authority. The manifestation continued for exactly 17 minutes, but during that time we received strategic intelligence that covered conflicts spanning 2,000 years. Battle plans that had succeeded and failed across centuries, defensive strategies that incorporated everything from Roman siege techniques to modern asymmetric warfare, and most disturbing of all, predictions about future conflicts that the temporal formation claimed to be preparing for. When the electromagnetic disturbance ended and the manifestations faded, we were left with recordings of conversations that challenged everything we understood about military service, chain of command, and the nature of duty itself. But we were also left with the knowledge that somewhere in that temporal overlap, our missing soldiers were alive, serving under the command of historical military leaders, fighting in a war that existed outside time itself.